I'm wishing for something and it's being granted, and it's not enough. And there was this point I had this insight that really the problem's not with whether I get what I want or not. The problem's with me. That got me really thinking about Buddhism, and I've been really reading a lot of books on Buddhism that really kind of provided me with language to understand this insight that I just had in a bunch of ways, but maybe especially the second of the Four Noble Truths, that suffering comes from craving. That was a really life-changing insight.
Welcome to the Mindform podcast, where we delve into the minds of some of the most interesting people on the planet, discuss psychology, philosophy, and personal growth, and share the wisdom we uncover with you. Join us as we explore the art of forming our minds. Here's your host, Frank Lawton.
Kia ora from New Zealand. This is the Mindform podcast. Here we share real conversations with earnest seekers of the good life, uncovering gems of wisdom every time. Each guest is a unique expert in philosophy, psychology, and personal growth, and all are members of the psychotecture collective and training platform Mindform. This week, I'm privileged to be speaking with Amod. Amod is a gender-fluid philosopher and associate director of the Northeastern University Ethics Institute. He's a Buddhist with a Harvard Buddhism PhD, but seeks to explore wisdom of all kinds from all places. At Love of All Wisdom, his Substack, Amod cohesively discusses topics from wisdom, spirituality, and psychedelic experiences to modern cultural issues and the history of philosophy. So yeah, I'm excited to chat to somebody with a diverse intersection of interests and expertise here. How are you doing today, Amod? Welcome to the podcast.
I'm doing great. How are you?
Yeah, I'm thrilled. Just keen to be having a chat with an interesting person.
Great.
Yeah, I'll start with just a bit about you and how you came to be doing what you do. What are some of the key experiences, learnings that led you to be, doing the research and the publishing you do on these topics?
Yeah, so I mean, the big story was when I was 21 in 1997. I had a lucky break to get a job in Thailand right after my undergrad. And this was something great. Most of the jobs I'd worked up to that point had been kind of terrible, so I've been really wanting to have a good job. So it felt really great to have that. But the place that I was working, it was like an office of the UN, was very kind of political and sort of backstabby, and so it didn't feel great, and I was kind of really just wound up looking forward to the time when I could get out of there and go up country and travel. And I mean, before that, kind of the bigger thing in my life had been, I felt very, very lonely and always really wanted a girlfriend, and I found one in Thailand, but she turned out to be kind of mean and a bully, and so I was kind of waiting for that relationship to end. And then then she left, and I finally got to go up and travel around the country, but I felt unhappy because I was lonely and didn't have anyone to talk to. And then I was at a guest house where the owners were kind of having dinner, and so I could talk to them, but their English wasn't very good, and it was kind of hard to relate to them. And I sort of wished I had some foreigners to talk to, and then I found some foreigners to talk to, but I didn't like them very much. Throughout all of this, I like I was really kind of getting the sense of, like, yes, I'm wishing for something and it's being granted, and it's not enough. And there was this point, I think I was up in the jungles of Laos at this point, where I kind of had this insight that really the problem's not with whether I get what I want or not. The problem's with me. And what was fortunate was that, over the past several months in Thailand, in Bangkok, where I'd been working, I'd gone around exploring the Buddhist temples all the time because they're so gorgeous. They're these dazzling feasts of color. And then that got me really thinking about Buddhism, and I've been really reading a lot of books on Buddhism. And it was Buddhism that really kind of provided me with language to understand this insight that I just had. In a bunch of ways, but maybe especially the second of the Four Noble Truths, that suffering comes from craving.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a really life-changing insight. And it's shaped my life ever since. And up until that point, I'd been before that I'd been kind of exploring Western philosophy quite a bit, especially through kind of online discussions with a friend of mine who'd been in a Great Books program in Halifax, and and so I've been thinking a lot about Western philosophy in various ways, and I'd started, it started kind of thinking maybe sort of less with the sort of more politically oriented utilitarian kind of philosophies that I'd started with, and moved a bit more towards Aristotle kind of his uh, views of a flourishing life. One of the things that really I could see was that whatever Western philosophies we were talking about, they were just coming from a very different place from the Buddhist philosophies, and yet it seemed very clear to me that if not quite both were true, that there was a lot of truth in both, and I really, from that point on, was really passionate about the question of how can these different ways of viewing the world fit together, and that's really what I set out to do when I went for my PhD program, and so I wound up studying Buddhism there, and didn't like most people who get a PhD, I did not actually get a faculty job, but that didn't stop me from doing the scholarship and reading and writing, and exploring the questions I'm passionate about and sharing the ideas with others. And so I've been writing the blog Love of All Wisdom for what, 16 years now. I started in 2009, basically shortly after I finished the PhD,
Wow.
and I'm now putting it, so it's on that, and that all of that 16 years worth of information is on the blog site loveofallwisdom.com. But in recent years, I've also put it on Substack, and kind of mirrored the content, that the new content, to make it easier for people to
Oh,
find.
okay.
So
Okay. Well, we
yeah,
found you. We found you through Substack. I didn't realize
yeah,
that there
yeah,
were
yeah.
many more years earlier than that. That's good to know.
Yeah, yeah, no, you can. There are several hundred old posts on the blog site. So if you really want to take a deep dive, there's a lot to check out there.
Yeah, I have been, and I haven't run out of breath yet, so I may
Yeah,
just
yeah,
dive
yeah.
deeper. Awesome. Okay. Okay. So it was before. Let me just get this right. So before you encountered Buddhism through that insight, and then saying, "Oh, there's some resonance here with this insight and this philosophy," and then the passion to go deeper and explore that through your PhD. Were you working? Were you studying or working in spaces around Western philosophy and history of Western philosophy, or was that just out of interest at that point?
Well, it was mainly out of interest. I was very politically active as a teenager,
Oh, I see.
and
Okay.
was kind of motivated to change the world in that way. And so my undergrad was actually in social science, in sociology and geography, and that was kind of the way that I was expecting I would go, and that's kind of what led me towards that job at the UN. But again, I had this friend who was really deeply into Western philosophy and wanted to talk about it, and we had this email list, which was a very new and exciting technology in the 1990s, where we would kind of go back and forth and talk more about philosophy, and that really just got me reading more and more of it in my spare time. And I would take elective courses in philosophy where I could, and so that
Hmm.
Western philosophy had become a passion for me already by the time I was in Thailand.
Okay. Awesome. Well, I'm intrigued. So you're in the activism world, right? By the sounds of it, you're interested in. Go on. Yeah.
Well, I was, and I think one of the things that Buddhism kind of taught me was that that's not the be all and end all of a good life. I think, and I've kind of come to realize in the years since, just how often we in the West tend to assume that what makes a life good is the amount of social change you're able to accomplish. I think some philosophical traditions, especially utilitarianism, I think tend to really encourage you in that direction. But I got chastened on that early. I mean, both, by the kind of Buddhist ideas themselves that were really kind of focusing more on sort of personal development, and also, at that UN office, I had my boss was very kind of activist oriented. I guess I heard she was a former Maoist. We were working on people with disabilities in Asia and the Pacific, and she had this number that there are 300 million of them. And she would always talk about, I've got 300 million people depending on me, and it became clear to me, the more she said this, that when you've got those 300 million people that you're depending on, who gives a shit about the one little young worker you've got working for you, right? That's nothing compared to 300 million. Who cares? I mean, I don't know if I'm allowed to swear on this, but hopefully that's okay.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I don't care.
Yeah, but who cares about the colleagues and the coworkers that you have to work on? They're just tiny compared to that sort of larger um, social change you're trying to make. And that's left me with kind of a lifelong suspicion of
Hmm.
people who really define a good life in terms of large scale social change and activism. And I think one of the reasons, and I guess that had already been brewing in my head a bit, one of the reasons I've been kind of moving from utilitarianism more towards Aristotle was really
Like
thinking more
virtue
about kind of,
ethics.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I'm definitely a virtue ethicist, and realizing how, like, what makes a good life kind of integrates one's own virtue and one's own well-being in a way that you know involves supporting others and helping them, but not necessarily as a crusade to improve the wider social world.
Mm. I think it's very easy, and I suppose in the intellectualish West as well, but it's very easy to make a case intellectually for, well, yeah, why should you care about the one person around you if you've got 30 million people depending on you, right? I mean, I think the thing about utilitarianism is that it mathematically feels indisputable. What makes more sense, right, than maximum good for maximum number of people? I find, and this isn't actually a critique on those other views at all, but often um, the arguments that people present for something like virtue ethics, which I would probably say I'm there as well, or even like a rule based ethic, the argument people present for those often actually have a utilitarian sort of base to them.
Hmm.
But I'm wanting to know, what is your critique of utilitarianism? Why have you moved that? Why have you moved away from that and
Yeah.
into a more virtue ethics framework?
Yeah, well, I think we often tend to sort of intuitively think, oh yeah, the math is obvious. Why should I just help one when I can help a thousand? But I think that's kind of begging the question. It's already sort of assuming utilitarianism, in the argument for it. Like, why are we thinking that the best way to live is to mathematically produce the best total consequences? Where does that even come from?
Hmm.
And so, I mean, my critique tends to go a bit more onto the grounds of meta ethics, of thinking, what are our reasons for thinking things are good and bad to begin with. Um and and I think that really, like, goodness and badness, um they come out of something that's more deeply
Mm,
rooted than philosophical abstract reflection. That they come out of the kinds of beings that we are. We
yeah.
develop concepts of goodness and badness, by virtue of being beings who have consciousness, have interiority, feel emotions, feel pleasure and pain. I think the utilitarians are not wrong to give um, pleasure and pain a major role in conceptions of goodness and badness. I don't think that's exhaustive of what goodness and badness are, the way that they sometimes do. But um, we come, by the time we actually start doing any philosophical reflection, we come in with a lot of pre-existing motivations, and and those include motivations we can think of as ethical or moral in a more narrow sense. But even there, we do have stronger uh, drives to protect and support the people close to us in our families and close friendships and so on than we do people across the world we've never met. And I think that that's sensible, that is the kind of being that we are, especially that those people who are near us, there's a kind of mutuality and intimacy and a kind of connection and the sense of being a kind of a part of something larger that's not just a sort of abstract quantitative mathematical relation. And I think the Confucians are good are good about this, and sort of thinking about kind of our sort of natural sprouts of goodness are in those sorts of feelings of personal ties for those who are close to us, and as well as then our own drives for self-improvement. I think virtue ethics is typically closely connected with eudaimonism, and the idea that being a good person and having a good life or living well are very kind of closely connected, if not identical concepts.
Yeah, on Mindform, like in our community, that's kind of the framework that we, collectively lean into. I wouldn't assume that it's the sort of committed to framework of each individual in the community, but I think that's kind of a central idea that brings us together. Is like, yeah, the good life, joy, meaning, deep, lasting well being, and really by any measure, the good life is deeply tied into and most powerfully accessed by virtue, by knowing what your values and virtues are, or which ones you aspire to, and sort of actualizing that in yourself and through your actions. So I definitely lean into that. It sounds like, are you familiar with what's the term? I heard of this from what's his name, Alex O'Connor, the YouTuber, but emotive realism, I think is the term for ethics, for an ethical framework, which I don't know if he like made up the term, but it's a really interesting take. And it sounds kind of like the perspective from which you're building out your meta ethics. And I think it's often, there's always a perspective, right? You can't meta yourself out of all perspectives, or maybe you can, but to go back into thinking, you have to put yourself into a perspective. But I think the perspective there is that um, moral claims are sort of an actual form of emotional expression, right? Where we have this experience. Not only is the experience or the feeling of pleasure and pain, there's the experience and feeling of goodness or of badness, and different sort of situations, circumstances, attributes, whatever, evoke those feelings. And then what we're doing when we build a moral framework is we're just trying to use words and concepts to map what does and what doesn't trigger that feeling. But the reality of the emotion is not as a thing. And sorry, the reality of the morality, the goodness, is not a thing in and of itself. It exists, but actually as sort of as an emotion, or even a social signal of preference. It sounds like that's a bit where you're coming from when you say, I sort of step back from the framework, and then I look at, well, we are these types of beings and we have these types of feelings and are stronger in these situations than others. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think it's a helpful starting point. The
Mm,
place where I want to kind of caution us is in kind of getting then kind of too caught up in thinking that our emotions, as just as they are
mm-hmm,
the kind of deciding factor, right?
for sure.
Which would be a very anti-Buddhist thing to say. I think it's perhaps especially the kind of natural drive that I think we tend to have, that I think is most obviously counterproductive and goes against well-being, is the drive for punishment.
Mm-hmm.
I think
Yeah,
we
indeed.
very naturally tend to want to do harm to those who we perceive to have wronged us, in ways that usually don't actually make the situation better. Often the punishment kind of happens for its own sake, and And I think, there's a way that punishing people and kind of hurting them in response to hurt. It's like doing crack cocaine. It does feel good in the moment, but it doesn't actually, it winds up making things worse, in the long run. And I think, and I think Buddhists are right to sort of look at a lot of our cravings, in the same way, that there are a lot of things that kind of temporarily feel good, but are not really conducive to eudaimonia. So we have to kind of make a distinction, when we're thinking about, flourishing between, the our sort of emotional well-being, kind of considered narrowly in the short term versus
Mm-hmm.
in the long term. And I think, that's part of the general kind of virtue ethics approach is, don't think of actions kind of discretely, as don't take actions as the unit of ethical reflection, but take habits. It it's less helpful to think, what should I do in any given situation? What's the principle from which I can deduce that action? And more helpful to think, what habits should I be cultivating or discouraging, as part of the project of giving an overall flourishing life.
Yeah, I'm amazed in these in conversations about ethics and action how little I mean, in my conversations it comes up a lot, but sort of when I read and especially sort of in the Western philosophers in the last few hundred years, how little you see the distinction brought up between short term and long term well-being and also the different qualities of pleasant or unpleasant experience that there
Right.
are, right? Like there's um I think I would probably, if I were to put a label on sort of where I land when I'm trying to build up my ethics from somewhere, would be something like a mode of realism, just trying to map this landscape of, oh, when does this feeling of goodness and not arise, right? Or bad goodness and badness arise and trying to map that. But I think the skill set is, and this is a Buddhist skill for sure, is to kind of be able to watch those feelings over the long term and recognize subtle patterns and be aware of the fact that they can contradict each other, right? What feels good now can feel bad later, and at the most basic level, but it certainly gets more complex than that. But yeah, I think there's such a difference. I mean, you can feel a number of different things at the same time as well. You can feel pleasure and shame simultaneously,
Yes.
and what feels better, pleasure and shame simultaneously, or um, kind of pride or clarity and physical discomfort simultaneously. I suppose that's for you to decide. But go ahead.
Right. Right. Well, and this is, I actually had a blog post just a few weeks ago called "If Only Bentham Had Read the Kama Sutra," and that kind of goes a bit into this topic. But, Bentham, as the founder of utilitarianism,
Yeah.
had this incredibly simplistic psychology where he has this one passage where he says, pleasure, happiness, joy, which all come out to the same thing. And I'm like, no, no, they don't.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're like, the psychological differences are hugely important. And if you're going to be basing your whole philosophy on one of these psychological states, you need to know that. And, especially, like, he treats it as if it's obvious that pleasure and pain are opposites. But, it's not just like modern BDSM people who know that that's not true. Like in the Kama Sutra, they're already talking about people getting sexual pleasure from scratching and biting each other. Right.
Mm-mm.
That's pleasure from pain, in the
Yeah.
same way that we get from eating very hot food, right? Very spicy food. So you have to, you have to have this kind of psychological subtlety around the sort of relationships between all of these different concepts that are hard to tease out among the very complex kinds of beings that we are.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, and you can, to me, easily as someone who's practiced sort of the Vipassana form of meditation, body mindfulness kind of stuff, um, for quite a while, I really can see the connection between Buddhist principles and Buddhist practice, and being able to kind of appreciate those distinctions and those subtleties. Um, it is amazing how much people can contemplate the good life and contemplate morality without an interest and a curiosity in
Yeah.
phenomenal psychology. I mean,
Yeah.
what are we pursuing? And I think sometimes people imagine that to be leaning into arbitrary subjectivism or selfishness or individualism to look into that. But we all have uh, a phenomenal experience, and we need to access our own to understand not just our own, but others, as in the experiences of other people. And I think a morality that doesn't build on that is a bit absurd. And that would be my utilitarian argument against utilitarianism, which is that seeking, kind of simplifying the math of good feeling, bad feeling, and aspiring rapidly to do that without um, exploration of self and crafting of self leads you to have a big impact based on a really low resolution image, and you don't know really the quality of states that you're spreading into the world. You have no idea, and if you're trying to up your impact
Yeah.
without that subtle sort of refinement, it could be more harmful than
Yeah.
beneficial.
Yeah. Agreed.
Agreed. So I'm a bit curious about Buddhism and your journey with Buddhism.
Hmm.
I've read in a bit of your work that you've talked about. Now I might get these terms wrong. Mahayana and
Theravada.
the Yeah, very good.
Yeah.
Buddhisms, and so I'm curious about what's the distinction between those, and what's been your journey
Yeah.
with each of those, and perhaps how they relate in terms of not just the practices, but the metaphysics and the ethics as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's a big question. I mean, there were many other kinds of Buddhism other than those two, and the blog post that's currently up is
I read
about
that
that.
one. Yeah,
But
yeah,
yeah, and that's but those are really the two kinds of Buddhism that have lasted into the present day. The Theravada being a kind of Buddhism that really tries to stick closely to what the Buddha taught as best we know it, which tends to mean focusing on one's own liberation from suffering, whereas the Mahayana tends to the idea of the Mahayana was that you become a bodhisattva, which is a being who's kind of on the path to becoming a Buddha himself or herself, and you're doing that in order to kind of try and liberate everybody or as many people as possible from suffering. And geographically, Mahayana is really the form of Buddhism that's in Japan, Korea, China, Mongolia, and Theravada is in Southeast Asia, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, and Sri Lanka as well. And for me personally, I discovered Buddhism in Thailand and just kind of reading about early Buddhism. So I always thought of myself as a Theravadan, or to the extent that I was a Buddhist, I was a Theravadan, back when I kind of first got into it. But then I guess where that started to get a bit more complicated was during grad school, because I was looking for um, a, something to write my dissertation on, really kind of focus on project. And I'd been introduced very early in that period to the work of Shantideva, who's really fantastic Buddhist, Mahayana Buddhist philosopher from the 8th century, from India. Buddhism in the early years is all about India, even though it's not there now, um, or not much. But the book was really kind of powerfully appealing to me. Well, it wasn't at first, because there is a sort of like extreme altruism and self-sacrifice element to it, as well as a kind of repulsiveness of the body and sort of other things that I found very sort of
right.
off-putting when I first read the book. But then I was I thought I got a chance to teach a kind of small tutorial to undergrads, and I put Shantideva's work on that course, because I thought it would be kind of controversial. We got into discussion of a different chapter of it. It was the chapter on serenity or patient endurance, that especially has a strong critique of anger in it. And one of my students was was passionately saying, well, but what about righteous anger? And I said, well, I think according to this text, there's no such thing as righteous anger. And she kind of fumed a bit, and we had a back and forth. And at the end of that class, one of my students, I'll always remember this, came up to me and said, well, or in the conversation said, well, I get the feeling you really like this text. And I hadn't thought of it that way before, but I was like, yeah, I kind of do. And I realized, like, there was so much in this text in terms of its kind of ethics of emotion and its connection between ethics and metaphysics, that in a way that kind of brought a lot of questions out more explicitly than many other classical Buddhist texts did, that made me think, well, maybe I want to do my dissertation on this. And I did, and I, my dissertation on Shantideva is out there, and most of the academic articles that I published have wound up being on him, and I've wound up learning a lot from him over the years. And that's kind of kept up a certain sympathy for Mahayana, even at times when I would have probably thought of myself as more of a Theravādan. But then I guess over the past few years, maybe past decade or so, I think I've started to move a bit more in a Mahayana direction beyond that, in ways that actually do kind of come down to metaphysics. In that, what I think Buddhist schools really have in common, they typically tend to make a distinction between conventional kind of truth and ultimate truth.
Hmm.
Conventional truth being the one where they're people and kind of medium-sized objects around us, and that's where sort of stories happen. When you talk about, well, the Buddha went to this city and talked to this person, you're saying that at this level of conventional truth. And the sort of commonality is the idea that, well, there's something kind of inadequate about this conventional truth. You need to sort of have this other. You need to understand ultimate truth. Um, Now, where the Buddhist schools all tend to disagree is on what the ultimate truth is. But what they all agree on is that the conventional truth is kind of not enough. There's something inherently unsatisfactory about it, usually tied to the idea of the self as something that is kind of understood as being belonging to conventional truth. And and it's that critique of the conventional truth that tends to have the most sort of ethical implications of sort of saying, like, well, we shouldn't be attached to all the things of this somewhat illusory conventional
Mm.
truth. Um, but then, I want, as a philosopher, you want to start thinking about, well, how does this sort of shape out the level of ultimate truth? And I find the Theravada approach tends to be about reducing things to smaller parts, sort of. But I mean, physically, it's kind of an early atomic theory, but then sort of mentally, it's kind of an atomistic as well, in ways that I think have some sort of plausibility in terms of what we encounter in meditation, with the sort of critique of self that sort of makes us realize, well, look, these parts of my thoughts are just at war with each other, that,
Yeah.
like, I'm not one person. I see all these different parts of me all over the place that don't have a there. um
So question about that. So this is Theravada, right? Is the sort of
yeah.
atomist. So just to sort of paint a picture and get some clarity on that, what I thought of, because I read that article as well about sort of this shared idea of questioning conventional
Right.
truth or conventional reality. Um, what came up for me, so my experience in meditation is when I am focusing heavily on, like, on physical pain or physical discomfort, or something that's kind of this block sense of an emotion, or a yeah, something that's something that I'm feeling in my body that has that kind of simplistic, vague categorization to it, and then you feel more deeply into that, and you just realize it's a shifting and dynamic and kind of infinitely diverse and complex landscape of subtle moments of experience
Right.
that might be, you could interpret as pleasant or unpleasant, and there's sort of all different sorts of qualities to experience. Is that sort of part of the would that be resonant with the Theravada framework, which is that this is not what it appears to be investigate more deeply, and it's just a collection of things, and you don't need to group them together like that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's a kind of a sort of Theravada approach, and I think there's a way that that's right as far as it goes. And the problem is, and this is kind of where I start thinking more in dialogue with Western philosophy and kind of Western metaphysics that is often sort of looking for a kind of underlying principle or a
Hmm.
whole. And I found like just in a kind of scientific sense, a reductionist worldview tends to be pretty unsatisfactory. That I mean, natural science tends to take a reductionist approach of bringing things down to smaller
Yeah.
parts. But at the end, you need to kind of be able to think a bit more broadly, be able to kind of understand relations. And so that kind of Theravada reductionism like hasn't entirely sat well with me. And I wasn't sure what kind of the alternative was, but more recently, I have been thinking with Shantideva's approach. It's a particular kind of Mahayana metaphysics called Madhyamaka, means sort of the middle way, um, and and that uh, are you hearing the noise in the background? Should I ask to
No,
stop
it's
that
it's
or
uh
oh,
it's
it's good. Okay.
it's fine.
Okay.
I mean, I can hear
Okay.
it, but
Great.
it's not overriding your voice at all.
Okay. Great. Then so the Madhyamaka perspective actually says that the ultimate truth is kind of ineffable. It's ultimately it's emptiness. Because Shantideva, in the sort of metaphysical chapter of his major work, he's kind of starts out with this reductionism and says, well, everything's ultimately kind of reducible to atoms. But then he says, well, but then think about the atom, right? Like if it exists in physical space, you have to be able to approach it from above or below or from sides. That means it must have sides, and those sides must be in some sense parts. Right? So you can even reduce the atom, and atom might actually not be the best term now that we know that, like, I mean, atoms in the literal sense of indivisible, right? But in kind of modern physics, it might be better to say quark rather than atom. But this is basically saying that the quarks too actually are not indivisible. Like they can be kind of divided up, and so ultimately the real ultimate truth is not these atoms or quarks or other indivisible bits. It's just kind of a pure emptiness. Ultimately things are empty. Um, and there's a very kind of strong sense of ineffability and paradoxicality around that, which I find more intellectually satisfying in trying to kind of think through the big question of what is ultimate. The paradox is frustrating in its own way, but one that still I find kind of, as I push deeper into it, can still satisfy in a way that I find the straight up reductionism doesn't seem to.
Why I find that more satisfying too, and the reason is actually because I find it to be an acknowledgement of the inherent, and I think people can encounter this through experience, and ineffability of the experience of being alive, right? I mean, if with that sort of reductionist thing, it's like, okay, well, look more deeply or whatever, and then you find the thing that it is. But the fact is, we all, I think, the reason we're always looking more deeply is because there's this inherent sense of it just doesn't make total sense the way we map our raw experience with the concepts we have about it, and then that with kind of the emotional and moral and practical implications of what we experience as well. Like, those things don't inherently mean each other. Do you know what I mean? And I think
Yeah.
pulling back experience or material reality into being containing nothingness, that kind of doesn't make sense. But it kind of leaves space for that magic of, like, um instead of kind of having to say the illusion of things comes from these particular things, but I have no idea how it gets there. It's like, oh well, it just comes from who knows what, something that's so incomprehensible that it's just nothing. It's just nothing to us, and I find that more satisfying because it's an acknowledgement of that confusion. But something that's been coming up in a few of the things you're saying that I have a question about is sort of going back to the ethical conversation.
Mhm.
Um, how does one build an ethics from that place, whether it's from the
Mm-hmm.
place of, it's all inherently nothing. I mean, I'm just going to name sort of a few truths that you've remarked on, uh, that you sort of mentioned, and how do those fit together, right? So one is, yeah, it's all inherently nothing, and you hear people who talk about Buddhism like this. You don't hear it so much in Buddhism when you in the practice, but oh, nothing, it's all meaningless kind of thing. There is no. It's almost, people say that it sounds like nihilism, right? So there's the inherent nothingness or ineffability, and then there's the no self, right? Where of course most ethical frameworks consider the well-being of individuals, and then there's something you said earlier, sort of in passing as well, which is, well, how can we trust our ideas of good and bad, right? Like,
Right.
what is goodness and badness? Does that really map onto something as tangible and measurable as pleasant and unpleasant experience, or pleasure and pain? So if you get rid of the individual, you get rid of the sort of inherent meaning structures in reality, and you get rid of our sort of intuitive desire for positive experience and avoidance of negative experience. What's the moral imperative? Is there one?
Yeah, no, that's it's a great question. And I think so one of the things that I find appealing about the Madhyamaka emptiness view in that way is that um, because the ultimate is so sort of ineffable, and it's so hard to really say anything about it, the more of the work winds up being done at the conventional level, and so like the ethics all kind of takes place within the conventional, and the thing is just that um when you understand the ultimate, it changes the way you see the conventional. Right? That
Okay,
you see it as kind of like, and in a way that kind of does provoke you to be sort of less attached. I think kind of diminishing the attachment is a really sort of central part of that. And but the thing is, when you do have the conventional being kind of where the action is in that way, that conventional is also where the self is sort of operative, in ethics or anywhere else. And it means you have to recognize that yes, the self is ultimately unreal, and you have to avoid getting kind of too attached to it, right? That's kind of central part of it, that you get too attached to yourself, and then you're sort of tied to fear of death, and then fear of death is going to be a big problem and all that sort of thing. um, but but at the same time, if you sort of think of the self in a way that's more sort of um, divisible and mutable and heteronymous, that it's this kind of shifting thing that's not so fixed. You can still kind of work with it, practically in this
sure.
conventional way. Um, and in a way that involves, perhaps among other things, the reduction of suffering. Right? That's kind of the big imperative. I mean, and for someone like Shantideva, it's the suffering then kind of gets viewed as sort of free floating, as something that just sort of is there, kind of irrespective of people. And I have a kind of maybe my biggest intellectual sparring partner, Charles Goodman. I have a debate with him up on this, where he actually then kind of goes full circle and then tries to interpret Shantideva's Buddhism as utilitarianism, because it kind of breaks down each individual person and says, well, no person should be more important than anybody else, and so we should be trying to kind of maximize overall well-being.
Mm.
Um,
It
and
so often just comes back to utilitarianism. It does. It does. It's sort of,
yeah, yeah.
it's magnetic.
And I have a lot of critiques of Charles on that view, both kind of in terms of how we interpret Shantideva, and in terms of how we think about it constructively. But I mean, for me, I think one of the things that I've often really kind of wrestled with, I think there's a philosophical view that is, I think, implicit in probably the vast majority of us in the West, or in English speaking countries, that we don't think about enough philosophically. And that's a view that I've tended to refer to as expressive individualism, which is the idea that be yourself is something of an ethical ideal, right? And this comes
Sure.
back to, I've mentioned I'm gender fluid, right? The kind of the trans movement is often sort of identifies itself with kind of being, your true self, right?
Hmm.
And a lot of kind of gay liberation and so on is understood in that the terms, and I think it is actually a very powerful ethical ideal that our sort of individual differences are kind of morally significant, and that we should kind of cultivate ourselves as not as being ourselves and not just the same as everybody else, in a way that kind of resists conformity and so on. And I think, philosophers haven't really talked enough about that ideal philosophically, at least not kind of explicitly. Although, but you do see it in some people. I mean, even in Nietzsche, I think is actually kind of
Oh,
helpful,
big time. Yeah,
in that
he
regard.
relates.
And I especially like the way that, his subtitle for Ecce Homo is how one becomes what one is. And I think that's something that actually kind of does a nice job of putting together the expressive individualist and Buddhist views, right? Like you want to be yourself, but what yourself is not fixed, right? And I think that's where the Buddhist critique of self is particularly important. That if you think of yourself as just like, well, but this is me, then you kind of entrench your bad habits, right? I think of the sort of internet meme or essay that was like, sorry I killed everybody at the party, I'm an introvert. This sort of idea of like just sort of saying, well, my characteristics are kind of immutable and unchallengeable. Um, and I think the Buddhist critique of that view is really important and valuable. We need to be able to change ourselves and improve ourselves in a sense, but in a sense, it is about kind of becoming the best version of ourself, right? Within the context of this sort of conventional reality that is ultimately not fixed. Kind of being our best self.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, there's a clear resonance between the be yourself thing and virtue ethics. The way we understand, like, because again, virtue ethics is kind of the framework we
Right.
have in Mindform, and a lot of us really into Nietzsche as well. Because he seems like a virtue ethicist as well, and Ryan, the founder, wrote a book called "Become Who You Are," kind of inspired by that
Oh,
subtitle.
okay. There you go. Yeah. Yeah.
So I certainly resonate with that and the way I approach it, but the way that relates with sort of this idea of authenticity, or
Yep.
you know, don't sacrifice your self expression, be sort of stubbornly who you are, is, I think, sort of that emotive realism model, which is okay. But what's like if I explore myself, if I take time and I watch what triggers these feelings of goodness and bad for me, what really is that? And that's finding out what your values are and what your virtues are,
Hmm.
and then it's building yourself as an expression point for those things which you most highly value. And you can easily kind of map the psychology of why that would lead you to feel great. If your own self is expressing what it is that you value. But yeah, I think the concern again, you're saying, oh yeah, that sometimes that leads people to just kind of whatever is how they happen to be expressing themselves. That's me. Don't stop me being me. Again, it's just that lack of self awareness, really, and of
Right.
appreciation of the subtleties of the psychological experience. So there is a difference between, yeah, they're both sort of me, but there's a difference between the habits that I happen to have, or the feeling I have about this, or the thing that I want, or the stuff that's happened to me. And then there's these more subtle patterns of what makes me feel most alive, or what makes me feel most kind of coherent or cohesive, or what inspires me. Those are different conversations. And then, of course, that's how the whole self breaks down. I suppose then my question to you from that is, in when you talk about the no self, you say, oh, there's all these sort of different parts, these different things that we bring together into a concept of self.
Yep. Um,
Um,
just one
that
second.
is a bit loud, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so
Um,
much. Yeah,
yeah.
what is the authentic self? If you take an interest in that as a moral framework from those parts.
Right. And I think, I think the most helpful way to look at it is that, the authentic self is something that's kind of in the future, not kind
Mm,
of not in the past, right? That it's not who you already are, it's who you build yourself to become. Um Aristotle has this quote that he's not entirely satisfied with, but he sort of explores of saying, "Call no man happy until he's dead," right? Or say, or I mean, really say that nobody's don't say anybody's flourishing until they're dead. And there's a certain sense in which I think what is your true authentic self is something that is a question that is only really fully answered when you're done. And you're it's so and so it's something that
For
you're kind
real.
of like building toward. And I think, in some ways, just sort of circles back to the critique of emotive realism that we talked about earlier, that you like, what you don't want to be doing is sticking with that baseline that you start from in terms of emotions or any other kind of character traits, right? You like that, like, it is the baseline, it is what you start from, it's the kind of the raw material. You need to start from that, you need to start where you are, not from some kind of abstract, um, unrelated ideal.
Mm.
But then with that raw material that you have, you start. It's like, okay, now what am I going to fashion this into?
Somehow, yeah,
Uh,
somehow there's a directionality implied within that, isn't there? With
right,
what you're
right,
regarding
right.
if
Well,
you
and
look
and
into
and
it.
so, and
Yeah.
some of it. And some of it comes out of, contradictions, right? It's
Mm,
it's like,
mm.
well, I want to be happy, and yet I'm doing all these things that sabotage myself from being happy, right? Like they're all, again, these kind of conflicts within ourselves, right? And we are kind of at war with ourselves. Sometimes we're our own worst enemies, right? And it's sort of resolving that. I mean, it's become kind of a silly cliche at this point, but that whole quote of like, well, inside of you there are two wolves, yeah, and the one that grows is the one I feed, right? Like that, like there's some real
Yeah,
truth
of
to
course.
that, and that and that's it's about the habits that you cultivate, and what's really involved in having a good life is having some intentionality to that cultivation, and just deciding, like, well, what aspects of myself are of the greatest value that I want to feed, based on this person that I am. Whatever happens, the person that I am now is not the person that I'm going to be 20 years from now, one way or the other. And based on what I am now, what would I like to be 20 years from now? And sort of saying, like, well, there's this version of myself 20 years from now that I will probably become if I stay on the path that I am, which is probably going to keep myself screwing myself up in the way I've always been. Or there's this other version that I can intentionally build and cultivate, that I would rather be than be the person I am now.
Mm,
And so I'm going to kind of develop that better aspect of myself, and that's my true self. That's who I really am.
mm. No, I love that. It's a great practical prompt and bringing together from the different things we've been talking about as well. What I would add to that is kind of lean into the phenomenology of that, like lean into
Mhm.
how does this actually feel, and what are the different layers of
Right,
what's going on here? What does it feel like I value when I watch this over time, etc. Rather than, because that
right,
is the slip, right? Is that we can play that game, but we actually getting these ideas from culture or from someone else, or that these
right.
oversimplifications and abstractions. But if you're sort of building that from the bottom up, like you say, you start with what is, but you've got to look into what is, I think, as well, to really know where to go from there. Um, we're kind of short on time. I have a bunch more sort of questions that have been piling up in my
Yeah,
mind about how all of these things intersect. But we pretty much reached the end. I just wanted to firstly thank you so much for coming on, Amod. Really interesting stuff. And also, was there any sort of one thing, one idea, one phrase? I always like to ask this. You'd kind of like to leave this on of yeah, like a core truth or a sort of a practical point of direction.
I mean, I thought, where we just got to right before you asked the question, I think really kind of summed everything up,
I agree.
very,
I agree,
very,
without a
very
doubt.
well. And I mean, I suppose in terms of what we've been kind of saying, the Nietzsche quote of "become what you are" is a kind of nice way to
Nail it.
encapsulate a lot of this.
Perfect. Great. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, Amod. So people can find you at loveofallwisdom.com or that same title on Substack, right?
On Substack, yeah. They can find either of those. And about a year from now, they will also be able to find my book that's coming out with Shambhala Publications,
Oh,
tentatively
I love
entitled.
Shobala. That's great. That's cool that
Yeah,
that's your publisher. Very good.
yep. Working title is Serenely on Fire.
Awesome. Okay. Thanks again. All the best, Amod.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the Mindform podcast. I'm Ryan A. Bush, founder and author of Designing the Mind and creator of Mindform. Mindform is an exclusive community and training platform for sculpting your psychological software. Members get access to a group of like-minded psychotechs, including all of our guests on this podcast, gamified growth tools, events and retreats, and a collection of transformative programs for mental health and self-mastery. You can learn more and apply to join at mindform.io/podcast. I hope to see you inside.